Imagine standing at the edge of an ancient desert, watching the sun paint the sky gold across endless dunes. You're thinking about what it meant to be conquered. What it meant to face an army that didn't just want to defeat you. They wanted to break you first, to fill your mind with such terror that surrender seemed like mercy. That was Assyrian warfare, and the way they weaponized fear tells us something profound about how power actually works, something that modern defense strategists are still grappling with today. The Assyrian Empire, at its height between the 9th and 7th centuries before Christ, didn't just build military machines. They built psychological weapons. They understood something fundamental. The mind breaks before the body does. When you're facing an overwhelming force, your will to resist shatters long before your walls do. The Assyrians knew this, and they made it their doctrine. One of their most infamous tactics involved what historians call the skull pyramid. After conquering a city or defeating an army, Assyrian commanders would gather the skulls of their enemies, sometimes hundreds of them, sometimes thousands, and stack them into massive pyramids in the center of the conquered territory. These weren't hidden away. They were displayed prominently, where every person who passed by would see them. Imagine walking through your city and seeing that. Imagine knowing that's what happens when you resist. The message was clear and devastating. Resistance leads to annihilation, and we'll make sure everyone who comes after you knows it. This wasn't just brutality for its own sake. It was calculated, strategic. The Assyrians understood that if word spread that the Assyrian army showed no mercy, if the reputation preceded them, the next city might surrender without ever seeing a soldier. They were weaponizing trauma. They were using the fear of their own brutality as a tool to avoid having to use that brutality as often. It's a dark calculus, but it worked. Entire cities would open their gates rather than risk becoming another skull pyramid. The psychological component extended beyond the pyramids. Assyrian military propaganda was sophisticated. They carved reliefs into stone, records of their campaigns, their victories, their ruthlessness. Kings were depicted as nearly superhuman, trampling enemies, executing prisoners, conquering with casual dominance. These carvings would be displayed where conquered peoples could see them. The message was reinforced constantly. You live in a world ruled by powers you cannot overcome. Surrender is the only rational choice. If you like this video, smash that like button because we're diving deep into the mechanics of psychological warfare. And this stuff changes how you see power. But here's what's interesting. The Assyrian system, for all its effectiveness, had a critical flaw. It was built on the premise that terror could be scaled infinitely, that more brutality would equal more obedience, that fear, once installed, would stay installed. And for a while, it did. The Assyrian Empire dominated the ancient Near East for centuries. But eventually, the model collapsed. Resentment built silently in the hearts of conquered peoples. The fear transformed into rage. Coalition forces united against Assyrian rule. And when the moment came, the empire fell remarkably fast. This is a pattern we see repeated throughout history. Terror is an effective short-term tool, but it's terrible at creating lasting stability. Now let's think about modern defense strategy. Contemporary military doctrine doesn't deploy skull pyramids or psychological propaganda in the way the Assyrians did. We've moved beyond those tactics, at least in the explicit sense. But the underlying principles haven't disappeared entirely. They've just evolved. They've gotten more subtle. They've integrated into systems that look nothing like ancient empires. Modern defense relies heavily on psychological elements, but through different mechanisms. Information warfare is the new skull pyramid. When a country releases intelligence about another nation's military capabilities or exaggerates them, they're trying to create fear without firing a shot. When cyber warfare capabilities are demonstrated, when drone strikes are televised, when military exercises are publicized, there's a psychological component at work. You're trying to make an adversary believe that resistance is futile, that your capabilities are overwhelming, that surrender or compliance is the rational choice. The difference is sophistication and precision. Instead of displaying actual skulls, modern powers display technological prowess. Instead of reliefs carved in stone, We have satellite imagery, weapons demonstrations, and strategic statements made through press releases and official channels. The intended psychological effect is similar: create the perception of overwhelming dominance. But the method is far more refined. Cyber defense offers perhaps the clearest parallel. A nation that can conduct cyber attacks on another nation's infrastructure, power grids, financial systems, communications networks, doesn't necessarily need to use those capabilities. The mere knowledge that they could, the demonstrated expertise, the proven access to critical systems, creates a psychological pressure on the defending nation. It's a form of modern psychological terror, operating in the digital realm instead of the physical one. But modern defense also does something the Assyrians couldn't. It incorporates resilience and psychological resistance training. Military personnel are now trained to handle psychological pressure, to resist propaganda, to maintain operational effectiveness in high-stress environments. There's recognition that the mind is a battlefield, and that defending the mind requires deliberate preparation. Modern soldiers train for information warfare in ways ancient warriors never did. The difference between Assyrian terror tactics and modern psychological defense is that modern systems are built with the assumption that adversaries will resist, will try to counter, will deploy their own psychological tactics in response. It's not about creating such overwhelming fear that resistance becomes impossible. It's about creating enough doubt, enough uncertainty, enough perceived superiority that the balance of decision-making shifts in your favor. There's also the question of scale and reach. Assyrian psychological warfare was powerful, but it was limited by geography and communication speed. It took months for word of a conquered city to spread far enough to affect behavior in the next target. Modern information travels at light speed. A demonstration of military capability can influence perception across the entire globe in seconds. This changes the calculus entirely. A single cyber attack, properly documented and communicated, can create more psychological pressure than hundreds of skull pyramids ever could. But here's where it gets really interesting. The effectiveness of psychological tactics in modern defense depends on a foundation of actual capability. The Assyrians could only maintain their terror apparatus because they actually had overwhelming military force. The moment they couldn't back up the psychological message with real strength, the system collapsed. Similarly, modern nations can only deploy psychological tactics effectively if they have genuine military or technological capability behind them. If you're making claims about your cyber warfare abilities and you don't actually have them, you're bluffing. And bluffs, when called, destroy your credibility entirely. This is why modern defense strategy involves both the psychological element and the material element. You need the actual weapons, the actual troops, the actual technology. But you also need the psychological messaging, the demonstration of capability, the reputation management, the narrative control. It's a hybrid approach that the Assyrians would recognize the logic of, even if they wouldn't recognize the methods. There's also an evolution in defensive psychology. Nations don't just try to create fear in potential adversaries anymore. They also try to create confidence in their allies. NATO's collective defense agreements, for instance, are partially about psychological assurance, letting smaller nations feel that they have powerful backers. The messaging is, attack us and you'll face overwhelming force. This is a more sophisticated version of Assyrian deterrence, but the underlying principle is the same. Create the perception of strength to prevent conflict. The skull pyramid, for all its primitiveness, actually accomplishes something that modern methods struggle with. It's permanently visible. It doesn't fade. It doesn't require constant reinforcement. You carve it in stone or stack bones, and it stands for decades. Modern psychological tactics, by contrast, require constant maintenance. You have to keep demonstrating capability, keep releasing the right information, keep maintaining the narrative. Stop for a moment, and your perceived dominance starts to erode. This is one advantage that long-term historical tactics had over short-term information cycles. But modern defense also has something the Assyrians lacked: the ability to build genuine partnerships and alliances based on shared interests rather than pure terror. When the Assyrians conquered territories, they did it through fear. When modern nations build military alliances, they do it through treaties, through mutual defense agreements, through intelligence sharing. It's not perfect, but it's more stable. Fear-based systems are fragile. Interest-based systems are more resilient. There's an important lesson here about the sustainability of power. Assyrian power was based on the premise that you could scale fear infinitely, that each act of brutality would reinforce your control. But psychological systems have limits. Push people far enough, and they either break or they break you. Modern defense strategists understand this, which is why purely psychological tactics are rarely deployed alone. They're always backed by the possibility of actual force, yes, but they're also combined with diplomatic pressure, economic incentives, and strategic alliances. The pyramid, as a symbol, is interesting here too. The Assyrians used pyramids of skulls to demonstrate dominance. Ancient Egypt, by contrast, built pyramids as monuments to the afterlife, as statements about transcendence and continuity. Same form, completely different meaning. In modern times, power displays have shifted entirely away from physical monuments and toward demonstrations of technological mastery. Weapon systems, military exercises, cyber attacks, these are the modern equivalents of Assyrian displays. They're meant to be seen, to be analyzed, to create the perception of invulnerability. What's remarkable is how little has actually changed in terms of human psychology. We're still susceptible to fear-based messaging. We're still influenced by displays of power. We still make calculations about whether resistance is worth the cost. The Assyrians understood human nature perfectly. Modern defense strategists understand it too. They've just found new ways to express the same fundamental principles. The question that matters most, though, is whether psychological tactics in modern defense actually work better than they did in ancient times. The answer is complicated. Information-based psychological tactics are more efficient in some ways. They can reach more people with less resource expenditure. But they're also more fragile. A contradictory message, a failed demonstration, a leak in the information environment, and your carefully constructed narrative falls apart. Skull pyramids don't fall apart. They just sit there, accumulating meaning and terror with each passing day. There's also a moral dimension to this that's worth considering. The Assyrians paid a cost for their brutality, not immediately, but eventually. Modern nations using psychological tactics are gambling that they can avoid that eventual reckoning. But history suggests that any power system built primarily on fear and psychological pressure eventually collapses under the weight of resentment and resistance. The question then becomes, are modern defense strategies different enough from Assyrian terror tactics that they avoid this trap? Or are we just repeating ancient patterns with modern technology? The answer, I think, is that it depends on the specific strategy. Nations that combine psychological deterrence with genuine diplomatic engagement, with economic cooperation, with mutual defense agreements based on shared interests rather than fear, those nations might build something more sustainable. But nations that rely primarily on psychological tactics, that try to maintain dominance through fear and information control alone, they're essentially building digital skull pyramids. And those, like their ancient predecessors, are eventually destined to fall. The real lesson here is that psychological warfare is powerful, but it's not sufficient on its own. The Assyrians learned this too late. Modern defense strategists are learning it slowly, through observation of conflict around the world. The nations that survive and thrive over the long term are those that understand that you need both the capability and the will to use it, but also the wisdom to know when not to use it. They're the ones building alliances instead of just pyramids of skulls. So, when you see modern military demonstrations, when you hear about cyber warfare capabilities, when you watch strategic communications from military powers, remember what you're actually watching: the modern evolution of ancient psychological tactics. We've refined the methods, but the underlying logic remains the same, and the limitations remain the same too. Terror breaks systems faster than it builds them. That's a lesson worth carrying forward as military strategy continues to evolve in an increasingly digital world.